The Crimean War was the first time Britain had fought a major power since the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars, and in what seems like an ironic twist, but it really isn't if you consider that British historical efforts in Europe essentially amount to gang up on the biggest current threat alongside anybody else who happens to feel threatened by them, they entered the war alongside the French. The threat perceived at this point was Russia, and the main issue was whether or not they were going to let Russia have access to the Mediterranean. Behind about 15 different layers of political, religious and strategic smokescreens lay the fundamental problem for both Western European powers. The Russian Empire was large, and with that came considerable manpower and natural resources. With the knowledge of how they'd turned their own reserves in this regard into power through the Industrial Revolution, neither Britain nor France wanted to imagine what Russia might be capable of if it pulled off a similar modernisation and had unfettered access to the world's oceans. The Russians, on the other hand, saw the same vision, and of course they wanted to embrace it. But critical to this was forcing the Ottoman Empire to grant them more control of the coast of the Black Sea, and eventually unlimited access across the Bosporus and through the Dardanelles into the Mediterranean. Until that occurred, the Russian Black Sea Fleet would always either have to bow to Ottoman will or fight a costly action to force their way through, which meant the British and the French could argue about control of the Mediterranean all on their own. The Baltic Fleet had enough issues guarding against Sweden, faced a similarly treacherous passage to get to the North Sea, and would then be on the Royal Navy's home turf if it tried to expand. Whereas at least in the eastern Mediterranean, everyone would be competing at something of a distance from their primary home ports. This in turn left the British and the French having to prop up the Ottomans, whose navy had in some ways never really recovered from the devastation that it had suffered in 1827 at the Battle of Navarino, which ironically was inflicted on it by a combined British, French and Russian fleet. When the flare point came, and Russian and Turkish armies clashed in the Balkans as well as around the Black Sea, the Russian fleet showed up at Sinop on the 30th of November 1853 and promptly demolished a good chunk of Ottoman naval capability in the Black Sea. Whilst this battle is sometimes trumpeted as the first effective demonstration of the killing power of shell guns against wooden warships, the common narrative is perhaps somewhat overstated. There were 11 Russian ships to the Ottoman 12, but the largest Ottoman vessel was a 62-gun frigate, and only 4 ships total in the fleet carried more than 50 guns apiece. Conversely, the Russians under Admiral Nakhimov showed up with 3 120-gun ships of the line, and a further trio of 84-gun two-deckers. With their 4 largest ships having almost as many guns as the entire Ottoman fleet put together, plus the ships of the line carrying individually heavier guns, the battle would have been a walkover even a few decades earlier had they only had solid shot. Factor in the kind of shell guns that a line of battleship could bring to the party and the fact that the targets were frigates, and it rapidly became a one-sided slaughter. Despite the presence of coastal forts, the Russians advanced in 2 columns, one of first rates and the other of third rates. Placing his ships such that the forts risked hitting their own ships if they fired on him, Nakhimov's capital ships began a systematic destruction of their targets. To be clear, the shells did help, sparking fires and sending shrapnel flying that badly inhibited the Ottoman capacity to respond. The only ship to escape was a paddle frigate, the Taif, which made it to Constantinople with news of the defeat. With the Ottoman fleet in the area destroyed, the shore batteries were soon to follow, with the Russians suffering 37 killed and 229 wounded, against over 3,000 casualties on the Ottoman side. For reference, the total number of Russian casualties was about the same as that suffered by a single heavily engaged vessel at the Battle of Trafalgar, whilst Ottoman losses were over double that suffered by the entire British fleet in that same engagement. Whilst the Ottomans could call on 3 first rates that were in the Mediterranean, the rest of their remaining fleet was made up of frigates, whilst just the Russian fleet at Sinop had more ships of the line than the remaining Ottoman forces collectively did, and the Russians had more warships still in the Black Sea. It was clear that the Ottomans were on the back foot in this war, and within a month a large Anglo-French fleet was moved into the Black Sea. That it was present and waiting on the other side of the Dardanelles was testament to how much this situation had been anticipated. A good portion of the fleet was still sail-powered, and even the steam-powered ships used their engines as auxiliary only. so their rate of advance from their home ports was not especially fast. In fact, the British portion of the fleet had been cruising in the area since early summer of 1853, with orders to move in immediately if the Russians attempted a direct assault on Constantinople. A couple of months after that, and war was formally declared, marking the start of what is officially, and perhaps highly misleadingly, termed the Crimean War. Misleading because, whilst there is much to tell about the subsequent 2-year-long fighting in and around the Crimean Peninsula, which you can hear all about in Real-Time History's video on the subject, which is releasing tomorrow if you're watching this on the day of release, the naval side of the war would cover a much, much larger area. There would, of course, be direct operations in the Black Sea in support of the troops, but there would be considerably more operations elsewhere in that same body of water. And even before the outbreak of war, the British had begun work on preparations for what they saw as the primary theatre of naval operations, the Baltic Sea, on completely the other side of Europe. Significant reconnaissance work was conducted in the defences of the Russian ports of Revel, Sveaborg and Kronstadt, and on the final defences of the Russian capital of St. Petersburg. By contrast, investigation into the defences of Sevastopol and other Russian facilities in the Black Sea, whilst undertaken, was done with far less urgency. Significant work was being done in the background to convert existing ships to steam power, or at least auxiliary steam power, and to build new vessels that were designed from the start to have a steam engine. Again, somewhat ironically, these were all the fruits of a 2-horse naval arms race with France, with which the Royal Navy was now to be allied. During 1853, part of the constant diplomatic back and forth was driven by the knowledge that every month war was delayed represented more steamships launched, and not only was steam seen as useful, the ships themselves were considerably larger and more powerful than their predecessors. This was true on both sides of the Channel, courtesy of said aforementioned arms race. Whilst the ships were modern, the same could not be said for the officers. During the Napoleonic Wars, a system of permanent commissions and half-pay had been established in the Royal Navy. With little reason to retire, given the wide latitude granted to officers on half-pay, the upper echelons of the Navy had grown old. The first choice to lead the Baltic force was Admiral Sir William Parker, a man with an excellent tactical mind as well as good diplomatic skills. He was admired by practically everyone in the Navy and had just spent the better part of a decade in charge of the Mediterranean fleet. But he was also 73. He'd fought at the Battle of the Glorious 1st of June, he'd captained a frigate under the leadership of Nelson in the run-up to the Battle of Trafalgar, and it was now the second half of the 19th century. And when approached with the idea, he declared that he felt too old and worn out to prepare another fleet and take it into action at this age. The other choices of senior officers were interesting, to say the least. The even older 79-year-old Earl Dundonald, perhaps better known as Admiral Lord Cochrane, had spent a very happy Napoleonic Wars, leading increasingly lunatic but somehow largely successful ventures against the French and Spanish navies, and then, bored with peace, had gone off to lead the Chilean Navy against the Spanish, the Brazilian Navy against the Portuguese, and the Greek Navy against, funnily enough, the Ottomans. Indeed, his orders and operations in the latter war had in some ways been responsible for the aforementioned Battle of Navarino. Now Admiral of the White, he popped up at the Admiralty and offered to lead the fleet in a headlong charge against Kronstadt, which he promised he would take in short order by means of a heavy bombardment of poison gas, then choking smoke, and then mercifully more conventional explosives, followed by a landing by Marines, presumably to clear up whichever unfortunate souls had survived this seagoing apocalypse. With many not entirely sure of which side of the eccentric genius-insane lunatic boundary Cochrane sat on, their lordships of the Admiralty politely declined his offer. If it wasn't for the fact that Jackie Fisher was at this very moment preparing to enter the Royal Navy as a cadet, one might be forgiven for thinking that Cochrane regenerated Time Lord style into that man who would arguably become his spiritual successor. Instead, Admiral Charles Napier, a comparatively sprightly 67, was placed in charge of the force earmarked for the Baltic. He had also fought in the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812, where he'd captained the frigate HMS Euryalus, and had been in the process of arranging a single-ship duel with USS Constellation when he was called away as part of a larger squadron. He was on his way back to the appointed duel when news of peace with the US had emerged, much to his disappointment. He had then spent the intervening period championing reform in the Navy on everything from better pay for the men and the abolition of the press gang to the use of steam power and the integration of iron into ships' construction. He then led the Portuguese Loyalist fleet in the 1830s against a force of usurpers, playing a key role in their overall victory, before returning to the Royal Navy and playing a key part in resolving the Syrian War of 1840, which had seen the Ottomans and Russians, amongst others, fighting together alongside the British against Egypt, which was backed by France and Spain. Yeah, early 19th century politics is a bit of a mess. Back in the Black Sea, Admiral Dundas had led 31 ships into the area in the first wave, led from the 120-gun HMS Britannia, with numerous other Allied ships of the line, including 3 French 120-gunners, Ville de Paris, Valmy and Montebello, along with Napoleon, the 90-gun French warship that was also the first battleship in the world built from the keel up with steam in mind, along with a slew of smaller steam-powered vessels and a number of Ottoman ships following along. More would come later as the Allied armies were dispatched, but upon initial entry and prior to the official declaration of war, the Russian government was informed that the Allied ships were there to escort and protect Ottoman ships, with the Agamemnon, Sansparai, Terrible and Samson under Admiral Lyons being sent with 5 Ottoman frigates and 4 French steamships to escort Ottoman transport vessels to the eastern end of the Black Sea, whilst the majority of the Allied fleet settled in at the still battered port of Sinop. This done, the last stages of official peace saw the fleet sail back to the Black Sea end of the passage to the Mediterranean to await further instructions. These instructions arrived along with formal notifications of declarations of war and a 3-way alliance between Britain, France and the Ottoman Empire, with the Admiralty instructing all commanders on all stations across the world that they were to commence and execute all such hostile measures against Russia and against all ships belonging to the Emperor of Russia or to his subjects or others inhabiting within any of his countries, territories or dominions. The first stages of the plan were to secure Constantinople and offer support to the land war in the Balkans. For these purposes, the first Allied troops were actually landed at the Dardanelles and began to fortify and modernise the existing defences to ensure Allied control of access to the Black Sea and to seal in the Russian fleet. However, whilst this was being undertaken, the war in the Balkans saw a string of Russian reverses, and with the immediate threat to Ottoman territory resolved, Anglo-French eyes turned towards Sevastopol and the 2 Russian squadrons based there. The destruction of the ships in these facilities just so happened to fulfill immediate war goals and the longer-term strategic aims of both of the major players in the alliance. In April, the fleet was tasked with extracting the British consul from Odessa, and the paddle frigate HMS Retribution, along with the screw ship HMS Niger, were already sitting offshore. But the paddle frigate HMS Furious was sent in to actually fetch the official. However, the request to allow the diplomat to leave, which was delivered by one of the ship's boats, received no answer. On its way back, the boat was fired upon, but not hit. In response to the snub to diplomatic immunity, a combined Anglo-French squadron consisted of 10 ships of the line, 11 frigates, and 13 paddle-equipped craft of varying size, turned up offshore and now demanded that all Russian shipping in the port was surrendered. Usefully, despite the port being packed with various ships of all nations, the neutral shipping had been grouped into one area and could be easily left alone. The ultimatum said that if this was not done, the port would be fired upon. This brought no satisfactory reply, and so just after dawn, HMS Tiger, Retribution, Samson, Terrible and Furious joined the French Mogador, Vauban, Descartes and Canton in a prolonged attack wherein the ships sailed in by pairs, then sailed around in circles, delivering alternate broadsides. Alongside them, a number of small boats armed with 24-pound Congreve rockets sent an arcing barrage in at the shore defences. To the Russians' credit, they had about 70 guns in the shore batteries and had ample time to prepare. Red-hot shot, and the more regular kind, thus came back by way of reply. Vauban was badly shot up and temporarily set on fire, but managed to control the situation and then resume the attack. A number of other ships were also damaged, but just after lunch, the main magazine ashore was hit and exploded, and within half an hour the shore defences had fallen silent. Allied fire also destroyed warehouses ashore, sank a Russian frigate, and set a large collection of Russian merchant ships aflame. A small comedy played out on the beach as a particularly brave horse artillery battery rode up and tried to engage the rocket-equipped boats without much success, The return rocket fire being not up to the task of hitting such a small target, this play and counterplay continued for quite some time without any injuries on either side, until increasing fire from nearby warships who'd noticed persuaded the Russian gun crews that discretion was the better part of valour. Despite a lot of holes, the Allied force had only suffered 3 killed and 13 wounded by the time firing ceased towards the end of the day. Having resolved that the insult to honour had been avenged, the fleet moved off to take a look at Sevastopol, leaving 2 ships to keep an eye on Odessa, which would result in one of the very few Allied ship losses in the face of the enemy during the war, when HMS Tiger ventured too close to the coast in a fog and ran aground. Stuck fast, she was forced to surrender by Russian field guns just before a pair of Royal Navy ships were able to reach her. She was then burned in place, as she was stuck completely on the rocks, before Furious showed up to put her machinery beyond salvage with accurate gunfire. The same Russian field guns then engaged Furious, but proved less capable of engaging a moving target, much to the amusement of the locals who had watched the entire exchange of fire from atop the cliffs. After having taken a good look at the defences of Sevastopol, the fleet split up, half of it heading back west, the other half heading further east to see if there was a closer harbour that they could occupy. They didn't find anything especially useful other than a number of smaller towns and ports which had been largely abandoned by the Russians as indefensible. In May of 1854, there were 50,000 Allied troops, about 1/3 British and 2/3 French, ashore in the Gallipoli area. But, with the new plan, the fleet relocated to Varna, in what is now Bulgaria, and the troops were moved there as well. Whilst the troops they were guarding built up their numbers still further, Dundas adopted Baljic Bay, just to the north, as his primary base, where he was joined by a couple of dozen Ottoman ships, which comprised the bulk of their remaining fleet, including the 128-gun Mahmudaya, flagship of the Ottoman fleet. With Sevastopol the main focus in the Black Sea, but nothing much to do until the troops and their transports were ready, the Allied fleet instead decided to blockade the Danube in June, forcing a Russian withdrawal. In something of a foreshadowing event for later in the war, the Vesuvius and Firebrand conducted a number of raids along the coast, with the landing parties of the ship's crew and marine contingents going ashore to destroy chosen targets under covering fire from their ships. On the 15th of June, there would be the only actual confrontation between Allied ships and the Russian fleet, when 6 Russian steamships emerged to engage in a 2-hour long-range gun duel with the Furious and Terrible, which were keeping watch. Little was accomplished before the Russians withdrew, the British ships not being dumb enough to come closer to the shore to be engaged by the extensive shore defences, as well as a force that outnumbered them 3-1, and the Russian ships apparently not even liking the aforesaid 3-1 odds in the open sea, and so refusing to close the action over there. In July, the orders for the invasion of Crimea were received by the fleet, and the armies gathered in the western areas of the Black Sea and began to embark, whilst various Allied warships shuttled back and forth between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, finding timber for the inevitable repairs and as many small boats as they could beg, borrow or steal to facilitate landings on beaches that didn't have port facilities. Hundreds of transport ships were assembled, and combined with the battle fleet, the force set off in early September, numbering 412 ships in total. There was some nervousness about possible action at this stage by the Russian Black Sea Fleet, as the French element of the war fleet had risen to 27 ships, but they, along with the Ottoman vessels, were mostly either towing slower transport ships to help the convoy move along, or they were all packed with troops and supplies, or both, as neither country had quite the same number of merchant ships to call on, which left the British contingent as the sole guardians of the 5 long columns of ships. However, the Russians stayed in port, and soon Calamita Bay was host to 63,000 Allied troops, still about 60% French, who then headed south toward their objectives. A portion of the fleet covered the advance, with the French contingent, now relieved of transport duties, taking the opportunity to take some long-range shots at Russian defensive positions. A young George Tryon, aboard HMS Vengeance, was able to see the Allied armies had an advantage in that they could flank any Russian position near the coast, since the range of the fleet's guns demarcated a no-go zone for the defenders. However, communications between the Allied forces weren't particularly brilliant, as he recounts. The next day, at about 11, the army was seen to advance. The French and Turks, close to the shore, climbed up a very steep road, which the Russians were unable to prevent, as our guns would have been able to knock them over. The French rushed up most gallantly. The artillery had a tremendous drag to get up at all. Twice we saw the French shelter under the brow of the hill, making a short retreat from the murderous fire, whilst their forces were increasing. When collected, they rushed on, carrying everything before them. Now, for our part of the field, our men advanced, first coming to a village in flames, filled with sharpshooters who were driven out by the rifles, and were assailed by a storm of shot, shell, and grape. Now they came to a brook about 300 yards from the main Russian battery. It had very steep banks, and part of the men were up to their armpits, but nothing stopped them. They shoved each other up the opposite bank and rushed on right into the face of the battery of 24 guns. Took it, guns and all, killing or driving out the redoubt of all of the Russians, when someone hailed, "You are firing on the French!" A bugler heard it, sounded cease firing, which was repeated down the line, and obeyed. The 23rd leapt out of the battery, the Russians rallied, returned, retook their guns, and carried them off. In a few minutes the mistake was found out, but too late to save the lives of hundreds of brave men who, huddled together, afforded a fearful opportunity to the Russians to pour in a murderous fire. But our own men rushed up again as soon as the mistake was found out, captured 2 guns and routed the Russians who, like a flock of goats, now fled towards Sevastopol. With the British forces further inland, the Royal Navy was reduced briefly to the status of bemused onlooker and transport service for the inevitable casualties. That is, at least until they reached Sevastopol harbour itself, which is naturally quite easy to defend and had relatively recently had this reinforced by a set of massive fortifications. Whilst the British and French argued over the next course of action, the British favouring an immediate naval assault into the harbour as the army came down from the north, whilst the French favoured a slower and more methodical approach that needed a heavy siege battery to be brought up, the Russians made the decision for them by sailing 7 of their ships to the harbour entrance and scuttling them, blocking the way in, but also preventing the remaining Russian warships from being able to leave. With that, any chance of a great battle on the high seas came to an end. Instead, the British headed further south to Balaclava, chosen to become the closest base for landing supplies, evacuating wounded, and basing ships for the upcoming siege. But, although close, it was also small, the larger warships being forced to anchor outside the bay to allow the smaller ships shelter and the transports room to offload, whilst the French picked Camiche Bay for their ships. Without much to do at sea, the Russians instead put Admiral Nakhimov in charge of the defences of Sevastopol, which was something of a masterstroke since the experienced officer turned out to also be a master of siege defence. The war on land would now take on something of a naval element. The stuck Russian sailors were sent to join the defenders along with hundreds of guns from their ships, whilst on the Allied side the lack of any immediate naval threat and a shortage of siege guns and experienced gunners saw several thousand sailors and marines along with about 160 heavy guns landed to form several battalions and a good portion of the siege artillery, with everything from 32-pounder cannon to 68-pounder guns, 8-inch shell guns and rifled Lancaster guns. The intensity of this work can be seen from the fact that those naval personnel landed ashore would net a total of 13 Victoria Crosses during the campaign. The ships that still had a meaningful armament then sat around wondering what to do, until it was decided that they could help in the planned opening mass bombardment on the 17th of October. Broadly speaking, the British ships would be lined up against the northern fortifications, whilst the French and Turkish ships would take on the southern defences. Unfortunately, having sent so much of their ammunition ashore and not yet having had a chance to resupply, the fleet was a bit short of projectiles, and thus whilst the original plan called for a combined land and sea bombardment, the latter planned to draw defenders away from the infantry assault from the south, the Allied fleet actually ended up holding its fire to use what ammunition they had in direct support of the actual infantry assault, which was planned for around noon. But halfway through the morning, Russian defensive fire had silenced a good portion of the French siege batteries thanks to a couple of hits to poorly concealed magazines, and the infantry attack was called off altogether. This news didn't reach the fleet in time, and so the Russians were subjected to a long-range bombardment by the capital ships, whilst various small steamships moved some of the larger ships, those which were only sail-powered, into and out of position. But since both the British and French admirals were cautious about getting too close to the heavy Russian fortifications without due cause, since they would not be covering any troop landings themselves, the results were spectacular in appearance, but decidedly short on results. But the fleet did prove adaptable. The night before, a closer channel had been scouted out, and the 2 British steam-powered ships of the line were given the task of sailing down it, leading 3 sail-powered ships to give close fire. Fairly soon it was also discovered that simply lashing smaller steamships to the seaward-facing side of the bombarding capital ships meant it was much easier and safer when it came to moving them around than slinging conventional tow lines. Smoke soon filled the air and made the long-range fire from both sides even more of a guesswork, although unlike previous conflicts there was a lot of explosive shell and red-hot shot flying about, as well as normal solid shot. This exchange ended at dusk with 44 killed and 266 wounded in the British contingent and a similar number in the French forces. A great number of ships were badly damaged, with over half having been set on fire at least once and several had been set on fire several times. The frigate Arethusa was almost sunk, and several ships had to be sent back to the Mediterranean for repairs, in exchange for minimal damage to the forts, but with about 1,000 Russian casualties amongst their gun crews. Due to the confined space available, the Allied ships had been mostly stationary, which had contributed to the number of hits they'd taken, almost 100 in several cases. But the next month was to prove far more costly than any Russian fortification fire. On the 14th of November, what became known as the Great Storm blew in, sinking dozens of transports, including several carrying large amounts of ammunition and winter clothing for the troops ashore. Although a number of warships were driven ashore, and many more were damaged, for the most part the damage to the battle fleet was relatively superficial and easy to repair, and the more badly damaged ships had replacements waiting on the Mediterranean side of the Dardanelles. The exceptions to this being an Ottoman steam frigate, a French steam corvette, and the French 100-gun ship of the line Henri IV, which were all wrecked. As the situation ashore gradually recovered from the damage and mud wrought by the storm, the remaining ships got back to the regular monitoring and transport duties. A small Russian ship managed to thread its way out of the harbour in mid-December through the scuttled wrecks, and took a few shots at the siege lines before Terrible and Valorous chased it back inside. The close of the year would see Admiral Dundas sail home. His tenure in charge of the Mediterranean fleet had expired. He was replaced by Admiral Sir Edmund Lyons, his second-in-command. Likewise, the French Admiral Hamelin was replaced by Admiral Bruat. The naval forces also had changed considerably. A number of the sail-powered only vessels had been sent home, and more new steam-powered ships of the line were now in attendance. This included the briefly confusion-causing HMS Saint-Jean d'Acre, a 101-gun two-decker, which was not in fact named for a captured French ship, but rather from a bombardment mission carried out in the Syrian War less than 2 decades earlier. 1855 rolled on, and a new Tsar came to power, but nothing much changed apart from an outbreak of smallpox until a new bombardment was prepared for April 1855. In preparation, a few ships tried sneaking in at night and delivering close-range broadsides to the Russian defences, but the muzzle flares of dozens of guns provided the defending gunners with a good set of aiming points, and so the idea was abandoned after a few nights when it became clear that the Russians had caught on. The actual bombardment itself from the land guns fizzled out after a week. A naval bombardment a couple of months later on the 16th and 17th of June likewise accomplished fairly little. In July, though, specialised gunboats equipped with mortars arrived, and they would keep up a somewhat more effective suppressing fire against the harbour's fortifications. The 8th of September saw the first successful assaults on the Russian positions, but the naval supporting fire was prevented by high seas, which prevented any hope of accuracy at range. However, this assault precipitated the evacuation of the main part of Sevastopol on the southern side of the harbour, and the scuttling of the remaining Russian warships. Now, whilst it might sound like Black Sea naval operations were a bit lacklustre in 1855, there was in fact a key role that the Allied fleet would play. It just wasn't on the direct front line. Over to the east of Crimea is the Sea of Azov. Here, a great deal of trade and supplies for the Russian forces in and around Sevastopol were being produced and transported. It was, however, a shallow sea, and presented something of a problem if the rich targets within were to be reached, as Admiral Lyons summed up in late 1854. The importance of the Sea of Azov, considered merely as a channel of communications between central Russia and the armies of the Crimea and Caucasus, can hardly be overrated. It is of value in other respects, from the fisheries at the mouth of the Kuban and the Don, and to the training which these supply to a hardy race of marshmen. But the great value of the sea to Russia consists in the facility which it affords in moving troops and material of war cheaply and without fatigue to points which otherwise could not be reached without great expense and loss of life from the necessary privations attending the land journey. The heaviest articles, such as iron and even large fir trees of a size to serve as masts for small frigates, as well as tallow, cordage, timber for shipbuilding, and all other articles requisite for constructing and arming gunboats, are conveyed across by land carriage and embarked on the Don, by which they are descended as far as Rostov. From Rostov, all merchandise is usually conveyed as far as Taganrog in barges, and at Taganrog transferred to sea-going vessels. This arrangement arises from the circumstances of the mouths of the Don being nearly closed by the alluvium, so that nothing can pass which draws more than 4 feet of water. And in some seasons there is not even this. An enormous traffic continually goes on in summer by means of barges, in winter on the Volga by sledges. The chief interruptions will of course be at the seasons which stop the one kind of conveyance and compel a resort to the other. But the times of the ice becoming strong enough to bear traffic and the rivers being open for navigation are uncertain, especially in the southern part of the route. It seems not impossible that the reinforcements which are said to have lately arrived in the Crimea are drawn from the cantonments of the army of the Caucasus and have been conveyed in small boats from the northern embouchure of the Kuban, near the site of Temirok, which is within the Sea of Azov, to the Crimean Peninsula. Reconnaissance work thus commenced in the opening months of 1855, and in May a force of more than 50 steamships and gunboats set out with troops to occupy the Kerch Peninsula to guarantee access. Unfortunately, a recently completed telegraph cable meant that London and Paris thought that they could now manage the campaign from home, and the French part of the force was ordered to return to Crimea. Whilst the Royal Navy contingent was happy to proceed anyway, it was also clear that without the French troops they couldn't guarantee being able to get back out again, and so they returned as well. However, after some bitter recriminations were wired back and forth to Paris, by the end of the month an even larger expedition of more than 60 ships was on its way back to the Sea of Azov. This included a number of impressive modern steamships of the line, which would crush any resistance on either side of the Kerch Strait and then guard it, whilst the shallower draft vessels went into the Sea of Azov itself. This all went to plan, and soon 12 British and 5 French steamships were loose in the practically undefended Russian trade and breadbasket region. The Russians, having concluded they couldn't really defend the Kerch area, had withdrawn, trying to follow a scorched earth policy similar to that used during Napoleon's advance into Russia half a century earlier. But the burning of 4 million pounds of wheat and 500,000 pounds of flour, which they couldn't move away, only helped the kick-starting of the Allied campaign against these materials. They also abandoned 17,000 tons of coal, which the Allied warships would make great use of in the coming months. Weirdly, much of the military stores in Kerch were not destroyed, as a contemporary account records. The dockyard magazines at Kerch contained quantities of material and naval stores, boilerplates, lathes, engineers' tools, paint, canvas, hemp and chain cables, bales of greatcoats, uniform jackets, trousers and caps, knapsacks, belts, bayonets, swords, scabbards, anchors, copper nails and bolts, implements of foundry, brass, rudder pintles, lead, etc. The French were busy for a few days taking the clothing, etc. out of the storehouse and destroying it. The valuable stores were divided between the Allies according to their good fortune and energy in appropriation. Numbers of old boats, of large rudders, covered with copper and hung on brass, of small guns, of shot, shell, grape and canister, were lying in the dockyard. Outside the wall of the dockyard, which was filled with oxen and horses, was another long range of public buildings and storehouses, which had nearly all been gutted and destroyed. Soldiers' belts, caps, trousers, cartouche boxes, knapsacks and canteens were strewn all over the quay in front of them. In a word, Kerch had ceased to be a military or naval station, and the possession which Russia so eagerly coveted a few years before was of no more use to her than the snows of the Chatir Da, whatever that is. The first Russian ship to fall victim to the Allied squadron was the steamship Argonaut, pursued across the strait by HMS Snake and set afire as she passed under the protection of the guns of Yenikale, the town opposite Kerch, which was also soon to fall to the Allies. This, in turn, provoked the Goetz and Berdyansk, also part of the Russian squadron ostensibly based in Kerch, to emerge to try and attack the Snake, which held them off until HMS Recruit and the French Fulton and Megere showed up, turning the tables and forcing the Russian ships aground, where they too were set on fire. In total, of the 14 small Russian warships based in Kerch, only 4 of the smallest ships escaped into the Sea of Azov. Yenikale fell on the 25th of May, only 5 days after the expedition had left port to start their own escapades. Thinking the Sea of Azov too shallow for most ships and the strait too easily defended, the Russians had neglected to make any fortifications of any substantial size along its coast. Taking cues from the previous year's activities near the entrance of the Danube, the Allied flotilla now set out on a tour of destruction. At Berdyansk, the town the aforementioned steamship had been named for, they found the other 4 ships from the Kerch squadron already scuttled and burnt. When the Allied commander demanded the town's surrender, the governor was faced with a complete lack of shore or sea-based defences and rapidly complied. Grain warehouses and shipping were duly set afire, whilst other parts of the squadron chased merchant ships that were seen heading toward the River Don. Generally, where they could, the Allied warships tried to limit their damage to government property, but on occasion the fires spread to private buildings, sometimes because the warehouses burnt very fiercely, and in other places, where resistance was met, stray shots would have a similar incendiary effect. The towns of Arabat and Genichi were the next on the list. The fort at Arabat, the only meaningful emplacement in the entire Azov coastal region, had its magazine detonated after an hour of bombardment, but the small ships lacked sufficient men to actually occupy the place. In the course of 3 days, more than 200 vessels were captured or destroyed. Some troops at Genichi offered some resistance, but the warehouses and ships were able to be set on fire without any Allied casualties, as they came in under covering fire from their own ships. Taganrog was next, but centuries of silt build-up had left all but the smallest of the small ships unable to approach. Instead, 2 32-pounder guns were taken off of one of the ships, one of which was mounted onto a cutter, and the other onto a raft specifically built by one Commander Kalpa Coles of the Stromboli. One of the ships went back to Kerch and promptly returned with a flotilla of ships' boats taken from the capital ships, which were laden down with mortars and rocket-launching arrays. A local troop garrison emboldened the governor of the town to refuse to surrender, and so this odd collection of light craft moved in and burnt the government buildings and warehouses anyway, with direct rocket fire discouraging the Russian troops from anything more than a general smattering of long-distance rifle fire that only managed to wound a single Royal Marine. However, due to the suppressing nature of this rifle fire, the demolition teams proved to be a little bit more hasty in their work than they usually would be, and unfortunately the fires that they set spread and burnt down a good portion of the town as well. Next up, Mariupol likewise offered some resistance, and likewise the growing flotilla moved in and burnt what they wanted anyway. Then it was Geisk's turn. Here the town surrendered, and a carefully controlled set of fires disposed of the storehouses and other target buildings within 5 hours. After a couple of weeks, pretty much every major settlement on the coast had been attacked, and the relevant stores, ships and buildings destroyed. So the squadron spent July doing a series of victory laps, now targeting infrastructure such as bridges that were deemed useful to Russian troop movements, as well as revisiting the towns mentioned earlier to burn further stores that had arrived in the intervening time, since it was the start of the local harvest season. During this period, the small paddle steamer HMS Jasper ran aground at night and had to be abandoned and then set on fire. By the end of July, it was deemed that everything that could be set on fire had in fact been set on fire, with only the cities of Azov and Rostov being left untouched, largely due to the presence of a large number of Russian troops and the approaches being so narrow and treacherous that any attack would only have the support of the small boats that the troops went in on. And this would not be enough to offset the numerical disparity the way that direct supporting fire from the heavy guns of the ships could. August thus passed mostly peacefully. But at the end of the month, newly built warehouses had been filled with the ongoing products of the year's harvest, the season there starting in July and not ending until September. And so the latter part of August, and then all of September and most of October, was spent on another burning and pillaging tour. A few hastily built fortifications also had to be demolished. This continued until bad weather in the area, including the build-up of ice and the fall of Sevastopol, gradually brought their duties to an end. Although the garrison in Sevastopol itself was well supplied for the year, The activities of the ships in the Sea of Azov had deprived the Russian field armies nearby of critically needed supplies, and rendered it impossible to resupply the city, or their armies, for 1856, which more recent research has revealed was a significant factor in the subsequent decision by the Russians to sue for peace. Elsewhere in the Black Sea, away from Sevastopol, was the final element of Allied naval activity on this side of Russia. There were a number of other ports along the coast here, and whilst these had been harassed in 1854, not much else had been done. But in 1855, with the growing Allied strength in the region, the Russians solved most of the problem for them, evacuating Sujak-Calais, now Sukhumi, and then Anapa, in part thanks to the predations in the Sea of Azov, which made it impossible for them to supply their garrisons. Eupatoria, just north of Sevastopol, was also occupied to block reinforcement of Sevastopol, with warships stationed offshore to provide fire support if it was attacked. That turned out to be just as well, since a major attack by 20,000 troops was driven off only with the help of the 6 warships, 4 British, 1 French and 1 Ottoman, which were stationed offshore. With the fall of Sevastopol, plans were put in place for the 1856 campaign. This would eventually come to nothing, as a peace treaty would be signed early in 1856, but the groundwork being laid would lead to one final major naval attack on shore fortifications in this area, the Battle of Kinburn. Kinburn itself wasn't especially valuable, but as a fortress, it guarded the entrance of the Dnieper River into the Black Sea. Further up the river were the towns of Kherson and Nikolaev, which were the main land objectives, whilst being able to repeat the Azov raids along the river held attraction to the Allied navies. The central fortress was designed to hold 80 guns and 20 mortars, with outlying minor forts in support of it. Having learned much from the ineffective bombardments of Sevastopol, the Allied fleets had arrived not prepared to pull any punches, turning up with a significant force of steam-powered ships of the line, steam frigates, gunboats, mortar ships, and other vessels, almost 100 in total. The French had also brought along something new. After the damage to their ships in the 1854 bombardment, they'd started working on armoured floating batteries, and 3 of them, Devastation, Lave, and Tonnant, had been rapidly constructed and showed up just too late for the 1855 bombardment of Sevastopol. Instead, they would be deployed here. These vessels had limited steam power, 4.5 inches of iron armour, and 30 guns apiece. The fleet also brought 9,000 troops to effect a landing as soon as the defences were suppressed. The first moves came when 8 gunboats, half British and half French, passed by on the riverside of the Kinburn Spit, where they landed troops to cut off the fort from reinforcement. Then the mortarcraft opened up on the 15th of October, as recounted by one of the men aboard HMS Odin. About 2 p.m. our mortar vessels opened fire, in which we joined with our long 64s, throwing shot and shell into the fort, which they returned in a plucky manner, although their range was indifferent, their shot dropping short or going over, except for one shot which destroyed the boat of the mortar vessel Camel. Most of our 13-inch shells fell and burst inside the large fort and must have done immense damage, but the enemy would not give in, although they must have seen how useless was their resistance to such an overwhelming force as we brought against them. One of their storehouses in the fort was ablaze, and as they saw our troops advancing against them on the land side, they set fire to the village outside the fort. The attack on the 16th was called off due to bad weather, and so the main attack commenced on the 17th, exactly a year since the first bombardment of Sevastopol had ended so poorly. The steam frigates bracketed the fort, the gunboats and mortar ships backstopped them, and the steam battleships set themselves in a line of battle directly opposite the main enemy guns. Tucked between the battleships and the fort were the 3 armoured batteries, able to fire accurately at point-blank range as the vigorous return fire simply pattered harmlessly from their armoured hulls. This time, Allied casualties were a lot lower, only 2 men wounded in the British formation, as a combination of arcing mortar shells and a hail of direct fire ate away at the defences and suppressed the Russian gunners. As the Russian fire began to die, the various formations began to close the range, making the situation in the fort even more untenable. By noon, the main fort was largely on fire, and the outer walls began to collapse. Before sunset, the fort had surrendered. Seeing the rapid destruction of the most powerful fortification in the area, the defenders of the other forts and batteries around the river entrance were destroyed and abandoned by their own garrisons the following day. Gunboats immediately began probing the defences of Nikolaev as the Allied troops started work on repairing the Kinburn fortifications for their own use as a base of operations in the area. Shallow water in the river meant the Azov tactics were indeed needed, and they managed to capture some massive rafts of timber that were being taken down the river for the Nikolaev shipyards. But with the campaign season closing and ice beginning to form, the fleet left a small squadron to help guard the Kinburn fort and settled back into winter quarters. Many headed back for home ports in the Mediterranean for rest and refit, with the details of plans for the 1856 campaign still being made in the cabins of the big three-deckers when news of the peace treaty came through. There are two other minor areas of operation to consider in the naval aspect of the Crimean War, and one other major one, in fact the single largest by commitment of warships. But before we look at the latter, the Baltic, we'll quickly cover the operations in the far north, the White Sea, and those in the Pacific. It is perhaps not fully appreciated that a war with Britain meant a war on a global stage at this time period. And since Russia has quite the extensive coastline, it meant that ships flying the White Ensign, along with the French Tricolor, popped up in what seemed like the most unlikely of places for a war that was ostensibly centred on a small part of the Black Sea coast. In the far north, guarded from the main expanse of the Arctic Sea by the Kola Peninsula, was the White Sea. This area was iced over for the majority of the year, leaving only a 4 to 5 month window each summer for large ships to reach it. Given its remoteness, relative inaccessibility, and other factors, it's little surprise that the defences in this area were basically non-existent, save for one place. Granted, one of these factors was a relatively lack of anything of immediate strategic value, but in summer 1854 the 6th-rate frigate Eurydice showed up along with two small steam vessels, the sloop Miranda and the corvette Brisk. They had a fairly open-ended set of orders. They were to capture or destroy any shipping that they found in the course of enforcing a blockade, attack ports if they could, and once the formal blockade notice had been given, this could spread to all shipping, not just that of Russia and its vassal states. The only target of specific military interest was Archangel, which had a small flotilla present and the only substantial fortifications in the White Sea. A couple of French ships showed up under Captain Guilbert, and the 5 Allied warships decided to go have a look at Archangel first. The Russian warships there refused to come out, and given that the harbour was packed full of neutral shipping, mostly Dutch for some reason, as well as being somewhat defended, the Allied squadron decided they were just going to leave it alone and instead enact a more icy version of what was occurring in the Sea of Azov. Working together most of the time, the 5 ships tracked down, stopped, searched, and then if needed burned ships, their cargoes, as well as warehouses and port infrastructure in the various settlements in their path. Eventually, they found themselves off the Solovetsky Islands, which settlements were centred on a monastery, as the area was active in many parts of the local economy. And with the arrival of foreign warships, some old stockades had been revived. The 2 British steamships approached, demanded surrender, and were refused. And after an afternoon of brisk gunfire ended with nightfall and the withdrawal of the Russian guns, as the British ships proved able to use their power plants to generate red-hot shot, which posed significant problems for the stockades, the Russians hunkered down in the monastery, and the landing parties went ashore to conduct the usual determinations of what was and wasn't government property, and then set fire to the former. Over the next couple of months, hundreds of ships were seized, and most of them burned. They were usually small, and the squadron didn't have that many men for prize crews, although some of the larger and more interesting ships were sent home for the prize money. With Archangel off the target list, the squadron broke out some records from the Napoleonic Wars, which was the last time a ship under the White Ensign had been in this area with any intent, and headed off for Kola instead to see what was flammable. The Miranda was sent in as it was the best place to navigate the river. Arriving at the town, they demanded surrender, and a truce was granted so that the governor could consider the offer. No reply was forthcoming that day, or overnight, and so the following morning the ship opened fire as landing parties went in for the more precise work of demolishing government property. This was in and of itself not unexpected, but for some reason the Miranda just kept firing after it had demolished the docks and the minimal obsolete defences. By the time dusk fell, almost every building had either been toppled or set on fire, including the town's monastery and cathedral. This action led to severe criticism in the British press, with the Miranda's captain replying that he and his men had been constantly fired on by small detachments of Russian troops using the general civilian buildings as cover, and thus making the destruction of the town the Russians' fault. Whoever was ultimately at fault, Kola never really recovered from the devastation, and over the following decades the regional centre of power shifted to Murmansk. As September 1854 drew to a close and the ice began to form, the squadron headed home. When the ice began to thaw in June 1855, a new squadron was waiting. This time, the fifth-rate Meander led the small steamers Phoenix and Ariel, along with the French La Cléopâtre, Cossite and Petrel, into the area. Blockade was declared, and after neutral shipping in the area was cleared out, a new reconnaissance began. The orders this time were a bit more strict to start with. The previous year's operations had caused price hikes in food and other necessities in nearby neutral countries like Sweden, which imported a lot of wheat via trade from this area. So, at least at the start of the 1855 campaign, small craft were ordered to be left alone to conduct this trade. Unfortunately, the Russians quickly decided that this meant they should try and sneak weapons and ammunition into Archangel aboard these small ships. Archangel itself had spent the winter massively upgrading its defences, and once the Allies discovered the ruse, it was open season on everything afloat once more. Trade in the area ground to a complete halt, but many of the smaller towns and villages this year made it through relatively unscathed. Unlike in the Sea of Azov, the warehouses and such generally hadn't been rebuilt from the previous year, so Allied landing parties often found nothing that could be described as government property and simply left again. In fact, until a decree arrived that forbade anyone, on pain of death or exile to Siberia, from having anything to do with the foreign sailors, many villagers instead took the opportunity to sell the landing party's supplies, everything from fresh fish and bread to furs and other cold weather gear. The flotilla would occasionally pop over to Archangel to see if anything had changed, but since it didn't, they got on with their business until the ice arrived in October, and then they headed home again. By the time the ice thawed out in 1856, the war was long over. Out in the Pacific, there was a bit more Russian coastline to go after than there is these days, as at this stage the Russians still owned Alaska. It sailed to the USA, being just over a decade in the future. Although everyone agreed that there was precious little of economic value in the region, and charts of the Russian holdings might as well have not existed, there was a Russian Pacific squadron, and there was concern that these ships might then try to attack Anglo-French trade in the Pacific. And so another fleet was organised. As with the White and Azov Seas, their objective was to destroy any Russian warships they could find, and if these refused to do battle, to raid and harass trade and industry until either it was destroyed or the Russian ships came out to defend it. The Russian squadron in question consisted of the heavily gunned but somewhat old 60-gun frigate Pallada, the smaller and more modern frigate Aurora, and an armed transport. Against this, the British called up the 50-gun HMS President, the like-for-like copy of the prize that had been taken in the War of 1812 when the latter had rotted out, which was given a break from annoying the Americans by sailing up and down that coast. Along with it came the Trincomalee, a Leda-class frigate that's still around as a museum ship today, her sister Amphitrite, the small frigate Pique, and the paddle steamer Virago. The French sent in two frigates, La Forte and Le Eurydice, the corvette Le Artemise, and the brig Le Obligado. Unknown to the Allies, the Russians promptly took Pallada as far up the Amur River as possible and sent the other two ships to Petropavlovsk to strengthen the defences there. The two Leda-class and the French corvette were sent to cruise the California coast, just in case one of the Russian ships was headed that way, and the rest set out from Honolulu, as Hawaii was at this point still an independent kingdom that was quite friendly with the British. And the fleet began a search that started with the Alaskan coast. Over the course of a month, they'd found nothing worth shooting at, until, making their way west, they eventually arrived off Petropavlovsk, which had been doing its best to prepare for an attack. Finding that even with the two Russian ships arriving, the fleet both outgunned and outmanned the defenders, the fleet then moved into attack. But minutes into the attack, a gunshot was heard in the cabin of HMS President, and the officers aboard discovered Admiral Price dying of a pistol shot to the heart. Whether this was an accidental discharge of a gun that was strapped to his chest, or a spectacularly ill-timed suicide due to stress, remains not entirely clear, but in the immediate aftermath, the attack was called off. With Admiral Février Despont aboard La Forte, assuming overall command based on seniority. The next day, now under French leadership, the attack resumed, but the ships were ordered to fire only at long range and were thus unable to exploit any successes that they had. Reconvening again, a much larger attack was then planned for a few days later, the 4th of September. This would be a combined land and sea assault, with all spare sailors joining the Marines in an 800-man landing party that would be covered by the guns of their ships. Although this succeeded in suppressing the gun batteries, which were then quickly captured, the two previous attacks had given the Russians plenty of time to set up further defences, and the landing parties advanced inland only to be ambushed by troops and guns that had been in positions in thick undergrowth, the ambush resulting in the Allied landing parties' withdrawal. As the fleet withdrew to make repairs to their masts and rigging and to tend to the wounded, outside of a handful of ships captured, not much else happened in 1854 in the Pacific. Over the winter, new ships were brought up, and the Dido, Encounter and Barracuda arrived along with the French L'Alceste to supplement the ships already there. Admiral Bruce was also sent out to replace Price, and this more powerful force set out in the spring, arriving off Petropavlovsk in May 1855 to find the place completely deserted, except for a couple of confused American merchantmen. Bemused, the landing parties carefully destroyed all the defences and government property, finding that the emplacements and batteries were considerably stronger than those that had been present the previous year. But at some point in April, the Russian defenders, hearing of the size of the incoming Allied formation, had simply withdrawn to the Amur River aboard the two warships that were stationed in the harbour, whilst the civilians had withdrawn the night before the Allies arrived when they'd spotted the sails on the horizon. This disappointment pretty much set the tone for 1855, a handful of small ships captured, but nothing much else occurring. The larger ships of this formation were less suitable for getting in close and wrecking every single tiny village they came across, as compared to the other operations in the White and Azov Seas. About the only excitement came when the crew of the 50-gun frigate Diana, which had escaped the Baltic in 1854 with a cargo of military supplies for Petropavlovsk, and then run aground off the coast of Japan in November of the same year, was found trying to make for home aboard the brig Greta, which was running under a US flag. The ship was duly seized and taken to Hong Kong, and with the coming of winter, the fleet dispersed, disappointed at the lack of much to do. Giving up the whole thing as a bad job, no plans were made over the winter for operations the next year in the Pacific, which turned out to be something of a saving of money, since of course the war ended at the start of 1856. Now, this covers the major naval operations of the Crimean War in all of the theatres bar one, the Baltic, as we've mentioned previously. However, given how long this particular video has gone on, and that the bulk of Allied naval operations took place in this last area, we're going to leave that for a follow-up video. Don't forget to tune in to Real-Time History tomorrow to hear how the Crimean War progressed on land.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.